My eyes never lie. They were open wide, staring back at me in the mirror of the dressing room at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. Those eyes would reveal which of the two dueling personalities would enter the ring as I took on the most intimidating opponent of my career, Marvin Hagler. It was nearly 7 o'clock on the night of April 6, 1987, the opening bell only about an hour away. Would it be Sugar Ray Leonard, the star of numerous conquests in the past, an American hero since capturing the gold medal in Montreal more than a decade earlier, the anointed heir to the throne vacated by Muhammad Ali? Sugar Ray was resilient, fearless, unwilling to accept failure. The smile and innocence of a child which had made him a hit on TV would be gone, replaced in the ring by a man filled with rage he did not understand, determined to cause great harm to another. Or would it be Ray Leonard, the part-time boxer at the age of 30, whose best was well behind him? His days and nights wasted on fights that never made the headlines, fights he lost over and over to alcohol and cocaine and depression. This was a man full of fear and self-pity, blaming everyone but the person most responsible for his fate, himself. In the room, with no one around, I kept my eyes glued on the eyes in the mirror. And this is an excerpt from the book we're going to talk about today, The Big Fight, My Life in and Out of the Ring by Sugar Ray Leonard and Michael Arkush.
Welcome to Performers, the podcast that takes you into the minds of the world's most extraordinary athletes, coaches and performers. We're your hosts. I'm Dr. Greg Young, and you've just heard from Dr. Duncan Simpson. As sports psychology experts, we'll guide you through the pages of their autobiographies, revealing the mindsets, strategies and habits that propel the world's best to the pinnacle of their fields. Our goal is to help you learn from history's greatest performers. For each episode, we read and then condense entire autobiographies into concentrated insights representing over 20 hours of work per episode. You gain not only the collective wisdom of these elite performers, but also access to over 30 years of our professional expertise in sports psychology. So listening to this, you're saving countless hours while accessing the distilled wisdom and proven strategies of the best in their fields.
Greg, just a quick bit of housekeeping before we get started with today's episode. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Performers Podcast and on YouTube for additional short clips from the show. We'll put the links in the show notes below. Growing these platforms also helps us grow the show. So back to you.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about this book today then, Duncan?
Well, we are returning to a more traditional sports autobiography after exploring the beautiful ones by Prince last week, which was well received by the audience. So thank you very much for staying open-minded as we ventured beyond sports. This week's book is a captivating read, especially for boxing fans, but actually there's got a little bit of something for everyone. It really does showcase Sugar Ray Leonard's what I'd call vibrant and complex life. It's a really enjoyable read. There's certain parts of it that are tough to read, and we'll brush over those. Leonard is brutally honest about his struggles, both as a husband and a father. There's obviously natural comparisons to Mike Tyson, who we covered in episode 7. However, although there's similarities and parallels in the story, they're also distinctly different, and I can't wait to get going.
So a lot of people will be familiar with the name Sugar Ray Leonard, but might not actually know much about him. So can you tell us a little bit about him?
Yeah, so here are a list of his major accomplishments. He won the Olympic gold medal at the 1976 Montreal Olympics. He was the first boxer to be world champion in 5 different weight categories, from welterweight to light heavyweight, which is absolutely amazing. His final pro record was 40 fights, 3 losses, 1 draw. 2 of his losses came in his last 2 fights, so his record before his last 2 fights was unbelievable. He won the prestigious Fighter of the Year award by Ring Magazine twice, and the Boxers Writer Association of America 3 different times. He fought and had victories over all of his greatest opponents, which we'll talk about in this episode. He is recognized as one of the top 25 fighters of the last 80 years by Ring Magazine, which really highlights his legacy in boxing history. He was instrumental in pioneering pay-per-view, and as such, he was the first boxer to surpass 100 million in career purses, and in total, he earned over 161 million during his career. And we're talking from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s here, so an incredible amount of money. And of course, with that resume, he was inducted into International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1997. So let's dive a little bit into his background, and this is going to give a little bit of a lengthy intro, but I think it's really important to set the scene. He said, "My dad, like many black kids in the Deep South, never made it out of elementary school in the early 30s. Grandpa Bilge needed every healthy hand put to work ploughing the fields of a large farm owned by another man. My grandparents were sharecroppers, which meant they grew crops on rented land for a percentage of the farm's production. For 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, Daddy hauled tobacco and cotton and sweet potatoes. Everyone did their share on the farm, including Grandma, all 4'2" of her. The story goes, on the very next day after giving birth to one of her 14 children, Sally was back in the fields. So again, a bit more context. Sugar Ray Leonard's father worked tirelessly for what he wanted. Eventually, he married his mother, Getha, I believe that's how you pronounce it, in 1948 in South Carolina. They moved to Wilmington, North Carolina, where he eventually found work at the Coca-Cola plant, which was certainly a better opportunity than farming. And Sugar Ray said good jobs for black men were not in abundance back then. The couple had 6 children, Sugar Ray being named after Ray Charles was the third of the 6 children. Sugar Ray Leonard's father worked grueling midnight to noon shifts, walking 5 miles regardless of the weather. His mother was working equally hard, and she served as a nurse's assistant, enduring a 2-hour commute either way. And this is the last little bit about his kind of upbringing. He says, "My father, my hero, could not write his own name. Eventually, though, I grew to have for the sacrifices he made and how tough it must have been to survive in a world without a decent education. Yet he never felt pity for himself or allowed anyone to feel pity for him." Greg, that's a long section, but I'm trying to set the context here. We're hearing about a really tough upbringing here, at least financially.
Duncan, it certainly is. It's a powerful glimpse into the grit and the resilience that shaped Sugar Ray Leonard's early life. That story of his father is one of unrelenting perseverance. It's working brutal assembly lines, long hours, walking miles regardless of the weather, and carving out a path for his family to succeed despite obvious systematic barriers that we know were present at the time. And it sounds very much like his mother was equally hard work, and then, you know, a 2-hour commute in each direction. It's clear that toughness wasn't just a mindset for the Leonard family. It was an absolute necessity for them to survive and for them to thrive. What strikes me most, I think, though, is the quiet dignity that he has here for his father's sacrifices. It doesn't go underappreciated. Despite lacking formal education, I really think that there's a profound sense of purpose and pride here within the family. So that kind of resolve, even in the face of undeniable hardship, it must be said, this must have been a defining influence on Sugar Ray.
And he talks at length about the positive impact both his mum and dad played on him and his mindset. And here's a little glimpse into their marriage, which wasn't always so perfect. And he said, "Violence was nothing new to me. I saw it in my home as well. Whenever my dad taught my brothers a lesson for acting up, which was quite often, though it didn't keep them in line for very long. His methods of discipline included an extension cord and making us bend down and put our heads between our legs while he hit us with a belt. Yet as much as I detested violence, I was drawn to it. I admired the power and control held by those who resorted to it. My parents, however, had no trouble confronting each other. Week after week they fought, and it normally started after one or both of them had been drinking, and often quite heavily. Nothing was as terrifying as the transformation Mama went through after she'd had a few drinks. There was no telling what Mama might say or do, or who might get hurt."
Duncan, it sounds like this is a really complex home environment, and one that's definitely at times, particularly if drinks involved, deeply troubling here. And, you know, the violence that he witnessed and experienced, along with the volatility of his parents' marriage, that obviously left a lasting impression on him. What strikes me here is how he describes both the fear and the admiration for the power and control that came when he witnessed violence. And that's such a raw and honest reflection, and really speaks to the way that young minds can grapple with these contradictions. And I think we saw that a little bit with Prince in the previous episode, where he had sort of similar things here, parents arguing and fighting, little bit of drink being involved, but was really able to find I don't want to say silver lining because that may glorify this year a little bit, but I'll say the silver lining in an otherwise pretty grim situation.
That's a really great breakdown. And I'll give a little bit more about that kind of context of the marriage, because I think it really sets the scene for Sugar Ray Leonard's story and probably how he interacts and treats women. And he says, "For years, I told myself lies, that my parents fought about money, the root of conflict between many marriages, black and white. Only in recent years, freed from my own indulgences in alcohol and drugs and owning up to, at least, to the pain I caused my wife and the 2 children from my first marriage, have I been able to examine the full and ugly truth. The fights between Mom and Dad were about other women. My dad couldn't get enough of them. People assume that I inherited my fighting spirit from my dad. It actually came from her. I have never met anyone with more determination, and that includes Roberto Duran, Tommy Hearns, and Marvin Hagler. I hadn't reached puberty, and yet I felt like I had seen enough violence to last a lifetime. From the fighting in the hood to the fighting at home, nowhere did I feel completely safe, knowing the next sign of danger could arise at any time. Greg, again, gives you a stark insight into his background. What stands out for you here?
Stark is correct. I think that's really what stands out for me. It's a very raw and vulnerable reflection from Sugar Ray. It's fascinating how, as a child, he internalized and somewhat rationalized his parents' conflicts and used money as the reason, which might have been much easier for a younger person to process than the betrayal that comes along with his father's infidelity. It just shows how much can be actually carried with you from a young age. But what really stands out is how he reframes his parents' influence. So while people might assume his fighting spirit came from his dad, he definitely credits his mom for that determination. And, throwing in those names, Roberto Duran, Tommy Hearns, and Marvin Hagler, his mother sounds like she could be a handful. But there's also the overarching theme of safety, I think, or what might actually be a lack of safety in this environment that he grew up in. So for a young boy to feel unsafe both in his home and in his neighborhood, it's no wonder that he turned to boxing. It feels like this is a kind of a traditional story for boxing, which is a very sad thing. But the ring is usually the place where some people feel that sense of control in an environment where they don't necessarily have it. So it's almost like he found peace in the act of fighting, which stands as a contradiction, I must admit.
And that's an excellent segue into this section. And it was really his older brother Roger, who was also a boxer and ended up being a pro himself, who convinced Sugar Ray to give boxing a try. And he says, there would be plenty of time to pick up the sport's rich nuances. What did matter was that from that day forward, I was hooked. Within a few months of boxing, I knew how to throw a jab and avoid a left hook. But picking up new skills wasn't what drove me the most. What drove me was the power it instilled, the sense that I was in control instead of being a victim. In the ring, for the first time in my life, I felt I could conquer any force. Strange, isn't it? The ring is where men try to do great harm to one another, and where I felt the safest. And Greg, really on, he meets his first coaches, who are Dave Jacobs, Pepe Guerrera, and Janks Morton, who would literally stay with Sugar Ray Leonard throughout his career, and they were his first coaches. So here's a little bit about his early days in boxing. And he says, like my dad in his yard in South Carolina, I took on anyone, including kids several years older and as much as 50 pounds heavier. It didn't matter. All I cared about was improving every time I put on the gloves. The boxing program saved lives. It was as simple as that. Spending time under adult supervision, our group avoided a more dangerous form of violence in which weapons of choice were guns, not fists. Our parents knew where we were and that we would make it home safely, even if it wasn't until 1 or 2 in the morning. For many kids of our age in Palmer Park, there was no such guarantee.
And what really resonates here is how he highlights the role that boxing played in the broader community. So for the kids in Palmer Park where he's grown up, it's not just about staying off the streets. It's a little bit about survival. The gym being a refuge, a place where fists replace guns, and discipline, which we know is hugely important for boxing, replace the chaos and the unpredictability that can be outside of those walls. It also speaks to the greater power of sport in general, I think, to give kids direction and teach life lessons. And I think we've seen that pretty consistently, certainly across all of the sport performers that we've talked about so far in the episodes. Programs like this don't just build athletes, they build character. If, and it's a big if it's done correctly, of course sport can actually teach us some pretty bad lessons as well. But if done properly, it instills values, resilience, respect, hard work, commitment, all of these different things that we know are very, very good, and things that we can carry on beyond the gym, beyond the field, into quote unquote real life, right? So Sugar Ray Leonard's story here is a real reminder that sport can be much more than just competition. It can be a pathway to a better life.
You're absolutely right. And on several occasions, Sugar Ray points to childhood friends that took a different path and fell in with crime and drugs, unfortunately. And he was one of the lucky ones that found that sport. So at the age of 16, despite being underage, Sugar Ray Leonard joined the national boxing team to face international opponents at 16, which is pretty wild. Officials overlooking the claims of eligibility.
I want an inquiry here. This is an absolute scandal. Are we breaking a scandal here?
Yeah, we're breaking a scandal. He made it to the Olympic semi-final trials in 1972, and unfortunately falling a little bit short. And at the age of 17, Sugar Ray Leonard became a father. The news of his wife's pregnancy really did not go down too well with his parents, who really blamed her rather than him. And Ray admits throughout the book that he was not a great father and he quote unquote fooled around a lot, and the responsibility was a lot for him at 17. And ultimately, Greg, he was on the fast track to train for the Olympics in 1976. So, a little bit about this. He says, I wish I could admit that I harbor deep regrets about my conduct, but that too wouldn't be the truth. I felt I was entitled to do anything I pleased in those days, from destroying other men to bedding other women, and nobody would dare try to stop me. Yet during these times of great promise, I was also feeling great pain, and it's difficult to know where to begin. I will simply tell you two stories, both similar, both equally disturbing, then and forever. So, Greg, he was sexually abused by a prominent Olympic boxing coach and also by a respected member of the community who on numerous occasions kind of handed him wads of cash and I think really groomed him. Sugar Ray doesn't go into a ton of details, and he goes on to say, I do not know, I am not a psychologist. I do know that I was in a lot of pain as I chased my dream for winning the gold. So, Greg, there's a lot to digest there. What lessons can you pull out for the listeners?
Yeah, to quote Sugar Ray Leonard, I do not know, I'm not a psychologist, is a good place to start, but there is a lot to unpack here. You know, his story, it highlights a very, very complex journey, not just as an athlete, but obviously as a human being. And then, of course, there's the honesty about his personal feelings, both as a very, very young father and his relationships. And it's sobering, and it's also a reminder that even the most driven people can make mistakes when they lose sight of their responsibilities that they have to other people. And lastly, and of course, most profoundly, is his ability to share the trauma that he endured being sexually assaulted. It takes an enormous amount of courage to face pain and speak out and make that sort of real and express that to other people. So that vulnerability, even years later, is a real reminder that pursuit of greatness often comes with unseen struggles. I know it's a cliche, but it's a bit like an iceberg, right? You know, most of it's under the water. We don't get to see it. We don't get to appreciate it in that sense. We've said before that tattoos and scars aren't the same thing. And Sugar Ray definitely has some scars from these incidents.
Greg, that's incredibly well said. And it's a really difficult transition to make based on those topics, but we'll do it anyway. So he does end up making the 1976 team, and we're not going to talk too much about it. He ends up winning gold, and he was one of 5 on the US team to win gold in Montreal. For context, Sugar Ray's goal was, I'm going to go to the Olympics, I'm going to win a gold medal, I'm going to get endorsements, and then I'm going to go to college. He had no desire to turn professional. With the endorsements I was likely to receive if I was successful, I'd be set financially and free to pursue my goal of being the first in my family to earn a college degree. The classroom would be no easier than the ring. Nonetheless, I made it clear again that I was done with boxing. The exact words were, my journey has ended, my dream is fulfilled, and I meant it. During the ceremony, when they played the national anthems for the 3 medal winners, one might assume I was euphoric, able to let go of the emotions bottled up for years. That's not what happened. No doubt I was filled with great satisfaction, the kind that can come only after investing every ounce of one's being into a difficult mission. I was proud as well for those who believed in me, my coaches, friends, family, and fans. It was their triumph as much as mine. Yet I felt as empty as I'd ever felt. It dawned on me that my career in boxing, which had changed me forever, was over. The reality was sinking in, and I wasn't ready for it. The end of a life that gave me more than I could have ever imagined, more than a medal and fame. Boxing was an escape from the places I dared not enter. How would I find peace now? So, Greg, his plan, as I mentioned, was to retire after the Olympics, but it just sounds like the sport isn't done with him.
That sounds exactly right, Duncan. And it's fascinating to me here how Sugar Ray Leonard approaches Olympic triumph with finality. It's the end thing. For most boxers, that's actually the platform that you jump onto into the pros, and that's kind of the natural progression, as you were. He's convinced that he's completed his journey here. But what really stands out here is the emotional complexity of that moment, even when he's listening to the national anthems. For so many athletes, reaching the pinnacle of their career brings overwhelming joy, that euphoria that he said that he didn't experience. So for Leonard, though, it was mixed with a bit of an emptiness, the realization that the thing that had defined him and given him that real sense of purpose might no longer be there. And I think building on that, it's a reminder of how deeply intertwined identity and purpose are for high performers and obviously high performing athletes. So boxing isn't just a career or a sport for him. It was an escape, a lifeline, a source of control in a very, very chaotic world. So stepping away from that, even with the gold medal in hand, that's left him with questions about what's going to come next and where he'd find that same sense of meaning.
So, why didn't he retire?
I don't know, you tell me.
Here we go. And he says, "It was not the decline in my popularity, however, that made me begin to reconsider my future. It was the decline in health of my parents. Both became ill around the same time and didn't have the money to pay the medical bills that piled up every day. After every visit to the hospital, the same idea kept racing through my mind. Perhaps I should turn pro. Only in boxing could I earn the money to help pay my parents' medical expenses. Was it a difficult decision? Absolutely. Instead of becoming the first in our family to earn a college degree, I'd be embarking on a vastly different sort of education, learning how to beat other people's brains in."
Duncan, here we have the US medical system rearing its ugly head again. We had this with Lance Armstrong, and now we have it with Sugar Ray Leonard. That aside, life sometimes has different plans for us. And what do they say? The cliches, the best laid plans of mice and men and all that. It's fascinating to see how unforeseen circumstances really can alter the path that we end up going down. And in his case, it's led into just a massive, massive legacy within a sport that he didn't really have any plans to go into.
Yeah, and of course, he's in boxing, he's thinking about turning pro, so before deciding on his future, he's invited by...
Who's that coming around the corner? Who's going to rear his head here?
Don King.
Our friend Don King.
Yeah, so Don King invites him to Yankee Stadium to watch Muhammad Ali versus Ken Norton, and he meets Ali before the fight. And this is a little section between the interaction between Muhammad Ali and Sugar Ray, and he says, "Are you turning pro?" Ali says. "I'm thinking about it. I haven't made the final decision," I said. Ali stared at me, his quiet eyes like giant black saucers. "Well, if you do turn pro," he said, "just make sure you don't do what I did. Don't let anyone own you. Remember, you are the one in the ring, and most of the money you earn should belong to you." He added that if I did go pro, I should hire his trainer, Angelo Dundee. "He has the right complexion and the right connections," Ali said. So, despite Don King's aggressive pitch to Sugar Ray decides to choose his attorney acquaintance, a gentleman called Mike Trainer, as his agent and financial advisor, a decision which would prove one of his absolute best. And as we said before, relationships rule the world. Mike Trainer was fiercely loyal and a very savvy businessman. Mike remained by Ray's side throughout his career, really guiding him to avoid these financial pitfalls that have trapped so many boxers and professional athletes. So eventually Sugar Ray turns pro in 1976, and he takes Ali's advice and invites Angelo Dundee to join his team. So planning out the early stages of a boxer's career is essential. For example, Dundee heavily advised against fighting a relatively unknown fighter at the time, someone called Tommy Hearns, who was fighting locally in Michigan. And Dundee said, "Look, this kid's a little bit sharp, you should avoid him." The team thought about it, and they ended up avoiding Tommy Hearns, which potentially, we'll talk about this, maybe a sliding doors moment. The team thought it would take about 3 years before Sugar Ray would be ready for a title shot. And in the next 12 months, Greg, get this, he fought 9 different professional fights in the next 12 months.
That is a ton. You wouldn't get that nowadays.
Yeah. And he says, "What would have happened if Tommy and I had fought in 1978 instead of our duel for the ages 3 years later? I can't be certain, though regardless of outcome, the fight would have altered the rest of my career, and probably not for the better. A loss might have postponed my first title shot for a year, if not longer. A win might have kept Tommy from developing into the force he became, thus depriving me of one of my most glorious triumphs." So, Greg, is this a sliding doors moment?
It certainly feels like a classic sliding doors moment, doesn't it? It's a reminder of how timing is everything in sport, particularly in boxing, right? And, of course, in life. And that decision to wait and set the stage for one of boxing's undisputed greatest rivalries, and in a way, it allowed both fighters to reach their full potential. I love the way that he sort of flips the lens here and thinks about, what could have been if we had actually fought each other. I wouldn't be who I was, he wouldn't be who he was. So, yeah, definite sliding doors moment for me.
So, as I mentioned, he fought 9 times in the first 12 months. He fights 17 times in the first 2 years from turning pro, and things were moving really quickly. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to speak over you there. Like, Jesus Christ. That's a lot.
Yeah, 17 times in the first 2 years. And he says things were perhaps moving too quickly. He talks about Dundee a lot in the book, and at times Dundee perhaps didn't do his due diligence on some of the fighters, especially Mike Trainer and Dundee really didn't get along. And Ray was nearly upset in 1978 when he fought Mexico's Marcos Giraldo. And this is a little bit about that fight, and I think there's some really great psychology here. And he says, the first punch Giraldo landed did not make me any more secure. His power wasn't real, I told myself, each punch capable of knocking my head off. Thank goodness I was in superb shape, or I might have lost to Giraldo, and there was no telling how that would have impacted the rest of my career. At the same time, I learned a lot about myself that night. I learned how to summon from somewhere deep within the extra will I didn't know I possessed. Knowing it was there and could be tapped again gave me a boost of confidence I would rely on for many years to come. Most boxers don't go that deep, and it's not because the will can't be summoned. It can. The hesitation comes from the pain one must tolerate to do it. You become exhausted and convinced you've given your last possible breath. As Ali memorably put it in referring to the latter rounds in the Thriller in Manila, you feel you're on the verge of death. That, however, is precisely when you must give more of yourself no matter how much it hurts. That is what separates the good fighters from those who make history. On the other hand, some suggest it is also when a fighter may give too much, his desire to prevail greater than his instinct to survive, and thus open himself up to the most severe consequences. His reflex is too weak to match his resilience. Yet, while a wounded fighter may be the worst judge of his faculties, he should never surrender. That's why there are 3 men in the ring instead of 2. Allow the experienced referee to stop the proceedings if he senses one combatant is threatening to cause irreparable harm to the other. A fighter can never possess too much heart. Craig, there is some mental gold in there.
There really is. You know, we've said it before, fight the war you're in, not the war that you wish you were in. That's another one of yours. It's a belt, I am stealing it. Sugar Ray really captures the essence of what separates the good from the truly great here. And it's as simple as the willingness to really dig deep, to tap into those reserves of willpower that most people don't even know that they have. I think we saw that with Lance Armstrong as well. And it's that ability to push beyond exhaustion, beyond the pain, that defines and really gives us that historic performance, not just in boxing, but in any high pressure endeavor. What's fascinating for me is the acknowledgement of the fine line between resilience and self-preservation here. And there's a tension here, that drive to keep going and keep fighting and keep pushing, but also that's versus the risk of giving too much. And that's probably something that every elite performer faces. And that is a balancing act. It's a bit of a razor's edge. There's mental toughness and there's physical limits. And that's what makes the role of an external perspective, that third man in the ring here, the referee, so important to know when that line's been crossed.
So we're into his first 2 years. He's had 17 fights. He's undefeated, and he's obviously having a lot of success. And along with that comes fame, financial rewards, and some temptations. And he says, in the same 3 years, I was neither a boyfriend to Juanita nor a father to Ray Jr. Looking back, I can offer no defense for my conduct. I was wrong, and I have to live with my sins and the ones to follow every single day. They eventually cost me my first marriage and deeply harmed the relationship with my 2 sons. At the same time, I wasn't the first and wouldn't be the last celebrity to surrender to the irresistible temptations fame provides. Until one has experienced the full range of pleasures that most people are denied their whole lives, and that includes sex with breathtakingly beautiful women, no one has a concept of how alluring they can be. If I had not been rich and famous, these women would not have given me the time of day. No possession was beyond our grasp, and there was no reason to wait for it. If I went to a car dealership and spotted a Maserati I desired, the car would belong to me within minutes. Car, women, they were all toys.
This is where success reveals its shadow side, which we've talked about a number of times. I think what he's showing here is the temptations that come with fame and fortune. And he certainly doesn't shy away from owning the consequences of his choices. He might not have been aware of them in the moment, but he certainly is now. But the honesty that he speaks this in, it's striking. It's not just admitting his actions, but also acknowledging that there is a lasting damage that he's caused to his relationships and his family. And what's powerful, though, is the insights into the seductive nature of fame. We've talked in previous episodes about some of the challenges of managing fame. Certainly with Mike Tyson, we've talked about the excesses that can come with fame. And it's not just the wealth of the access, it's the sense of instant gratification. Living in a world where limits don't exist, you can just say, I want that, and it's given to you. It's put on a plate for you. So that mindset, while obviously exhilarating, can be incredibly destructive if it goes unchecked. And it doesn't sound like he's got anyone to check it for him.
Greg, money also brought another set of problems, and he says, meanwhile, with every fight, every hike in prize money came the growing realization that to my family and friends, I was no longer Ray the son, Ray the brother, or Ray the buddy. I was Ray the bank. I was the one with riches they never dreamed of, and they believed they were entitled to as well. One day, somebody might need $300, another day $500. Rare was the day that a member of my family or friend did not seek some type of bailout, promising to pay me back, although we both knew he or she never would. We both knew they never could. It reached the point where I told them not to pay me back. Did I resent being my own private welfare state in Palmer Park, Maryland? You bet I did. More distressing than the loss of cash was the loss of closeness. No one bothered to ask, Ray, how are you? They came to me to fix their problems, never to hear about mine. How could I then tell my family or anyone of the pain, that darkness inside me? So I did what I always did. I buried it, which made me feel even worse.
And what really stands out here is how success has created that distance between him and those that should be the closest to him. His family and friends began seeing him as a resource rather than as Ray the person. And that's got to be a really hard blow to take. And that shift, it's clearly taken an emotional toll on him. It's a little bit heartbreaking, to be honest, reading that, or listening to you read it, how he's felt unable to share his own struggles. And he's really had to sort of classic male, right? Push that pain down because no one seemed to care enough to ask. Fame and fortune often isolates people. We know this is the case. And Sugar Ray's story, it's a stark reminder that wealth does not solve emotional challenges. In a way, it can actually amplify them. Duncan, a question for you. Do you think it's a common trap for high achievers where the very success that they've worked for kind of creates walls between them and the people that they once relied on for support that got them there in the first place?
It's a trap we often see with high achievers. The success they've earned can change the dynamics of relationships, sometimes unintentionally, like we heard from Sugar Ray. The people around them may begin to view them from a different lens, more through their achievements and the resources rather than them as a person before they had the fame and fortune. It's one of those paradoxes of success. Achieving what you worked for so hard can sometimes make you feel more alone than ever, and we've seen that time and time again. That's why staying grounded and surrounding yourself with people who really value who you are and not what you have becomes so critical.
It's nicely put.
So, fight 26, he's against Wilfred Benitez for the WBC welterweight title. And he says, the fight being held in Vegas, I'd have another key advantage over Benitez. Vegas was my home away from home, where I already fought 4 times and felt at ease among the high rollers and celebrities. Benitez, despite his playboy reputation, had never been on a stage quite like this and was likely to get distracted, if only slightly. And fights are often lost when one of the competitors is not completely focused on the man who will come at him from the other corner, determined to beat his brains out. You can't wait until the day of the fight to enter that zone. You must be in it for days, if not weeks. It's no different really from the leading man who must memorize his lines in rehearsal and then get into character before the cameras roll.
And I really like that. I think that's a really powerful analogy. Like being in the ring is like stepping onto a stage, like performing in a show. If you're not already in character, you're not already to deliver, you don't know your lines already, what's supposed to happen, when it's supposed to happen, you're setting yourself up for failure. Leonard understood that fights are often won or lost in the lead up to the fight, not just in the moments in the ring. So this is definitely putting him in an advantage to Benitez.
So let's hear a little bit about the fight itself. And he says, when I retreated to the corner, I told myself, here was the championship fight I had yearned for since committing my heart and soul to this life 3 years earlier. I thought for the longest time that I would never want anything as much as I wanted the gold medal. Yet as the ring started to clear at Caesars, so did my mind, giving way to the will that defined me as a fighter and a man. In these final moments, I never felt more alive and more authentic. It was as if I had entered a room where no one else was permitted to go, where there was no confusion and no fear, where I felt happy and at peace despite taking part in a sport that requires merciless brutality. In a strange way, that made sense to me. I found boxing's warlike nature serene, almost beautiful, and it is why I made my comebacks years later against my better judgment and counsel of others. I never did it for money because of Mike Trainer's shrewd investments. I was set for life. I didn't do it for fame either. There would be an endless supply of that as well. I returned to the ring to experience that pure, almost indescribable sensation I could not attain anywhere else. I miss it terribly.
I just love this, where he says, let me go back to it. I never felt more alive and more authentic. It was as if I'd entered a room where no one else was permitted to go, where there was no confusion and no fear, where I felt happy and at peace despite taking part in a sport that required merciless brutality. That's poetic. That, I don't know, it just that grabs me there. It's really beautiful writing, but it's so evocative as well. That feeling of how he's describing boxing, that sport of brutality, is serene and even beautiful to him. And it speaks to that importance of having that big purpose, something deeper than the fight itself. For him, the ring isn't just about competition. It's where he finds that meaning and that clarity. And the fact that no one else is permitted to go there, that really suggests that he's earned the right to be one of those two men in the ring competing in that merciless brutality. It's just such a wonderfully well-written piece.
So, to jump to the outcome, he wins by technical knockout in the 15th round, which gives him the WBC welterweight title. He says, some might wonder how two men who have fought for 45 minutes, tried to destroy each other, could embrace so soon after their battle was over. But it was precisely because we faced each other in combat that we needed to share this moment. Only the two of us, not our handlers or our loved ones, could relate to the sacrifices we made, physically, mentally, and spiritually. For months, the opponent was the enemy, the major obstacle standing in the path of greater earnings and greater fame. Yet, as most of us who fight for a living come to recognize, some sooner than others, the opponent is also a partner on the same journey.
Duncan, I love this. This is the sentiment here is the paradox of competition. The opponent, that person standing in front of you, that's the enemy. But through the process, they become a partner in the shared journey of sacrifice and struggle. And it's probably a bond that few other people can understand. The mutual respect that comes from pushing each other to the limit, not just physically, but mentally and perhaps even spiritually. For me, that's a real reminder that even in the most intense rivalries, we're not just talking about individual sports here, but also in team sports, there's often a deeper connection rooted in that shared experience. And I think that's why we see, when the final whistle's gone, when the last bell's rang, we see athletes kind of embrace themselves because they know they've shared that experience together.
Yeah, that's a lovely takeaway. So back in the hotel room, he says, soaking in the bath, stealing an occasional glance at my ugly face in the mirror, I ask myself the same questions most fighters do once every battle is over, win or lose. Was it really worth it? Were the rewards, as lucrative as they might be, worth getting beaten up? Not to mention the hits one must endure day after day in the gym. And what about the chances of permanent brain damage? Fighters generally bury those fears, but I had met enough who took too many blows to the head and by their late 30s or early 40s were never the same again. Would that be my pitiful fate as well? Would I have to depend on another person for the most menial tasks? Ray, you are world champion now. You have nothing left to prove, Mike Trainer said at the hospital. This is a brutal way to make a living. Isn't it wonderful to know that you do not ever have to fight again if you don't want to? Mike meant every word.
And the questions about the cost of a success and a little bit of soul searching, I think, is what we're hearing here. It's one that many high performers wrestle with, and there is always going to be the carrot at the end of the string, that allure of more success, more paydays, certainly in a sport like boxing where the purses are absolutely huge. And of course, the validation that comes along with that from those people around you that makes stepping away from these opportunities damn near impossible. Even when you have a very, very clear first-hand understanding of the brutal toll that the sport's taken on you, it speaks to a deeper struggle here, the pull between self-preservation and the drive to keep proving yourself. And you talked about that earlier, right? That desire to keep going and that relentlessness, but also the self-preservation, especially when you're at the top as well.
And I do want to point out several times in the book, Mike Trainer, who really benefited from Sugar Ray staying in the sport, continuously tried to get him to retire, which again, I think speaks to the quality of the person he had in his corner, that he could have benefited from Ray staying and fighting longer, and he was trying to get him to again retire. And to be honest, your reflection is this perfect lead into Sugar Ray, and he says, "But who was I kidding? I wasn't going to walk away. Not after climbing to the top of the profession at the age of 23. Not with more lucrative paydays in the years ahead. Not with there being no welterweight alive who could take me down. And not as long as everyone in my circle kept urging me to continue. And why wouldn't they? More than anything else, I wanted to be remembered as one of the immortals in boxing history, not just among my generation." So, Greg, how is that word legacy playing a role here?
I think that's a great question, Duncan. Legacy is, I think, central here. It's about how he wants to be remembered long after his career is over. The desire to be one of the immortals of the sport, as he puts it. That's the fire that drives him now from this point. When money isn't an issue, legacy isn't just about achieving things. It's about leaving a mark that lasts, signing your name in the history books, as it were. And as we said last time with Prince, as you quite nicely put it, it's about putting a dent in the universe, and for boxers, maybe in other people's faces. Do you think that focus, if that's the right word, do you think that focus on legacy helps someone or hurts someone?
I think a focus on legacy can probably do both, depending on how we approach it. On one hand, it can be a powerful motivator. It gives someone perhaps something deeper, a deeper purpose, a reason to push through challenges when others might quit, when they're really thinking about, am I going to be one of the immortals of the sport? And that can drive to leave that lasting impact and maybe elevate performance to extraordinary levels, like we saw with Sugar Ray. On the other hand, it could be a burden if your focus shifts from the joy of the craft or the process to an obsession of how others will remember you. I think it could lead to stress and maybe poor decisions. So, to summarize, it's a fine line. Legacy can inspire greatness, but it can also overshadow the present if it becomes all-consuming. So, jumping ahead, Greg, for a little bit of context, during this time he also gets married. Unfortunately, the relationship with his wife and his son continually are strained by his extramarital affairs. And after the fight with Benitez, he agrees to fight Roberto Hands of Stone Duran. Another nickname given to him was El Animal. Again, he deserved that one as well. As Ray says, he did not defeat his opponents, he demolished them. So here is a little bit about Roberto Hands of Stone Duran.
We're in the golden age of nicknames right here.
So Duran always went for the knockout and was angry with himself and the world if he didn't get it. Perhaps it was his difficult upbringing. His father abandoned him as a kid, forcing him to drop out of school and scrounge for food on the streets. But whatever was behind that familial rage of his, it controlled him as much as the other way around. So the deal itself with Duran was unprecedented. Ray was guaranteed a minimum of 7.5 million with a chance to earn a few extra million depending on the closed circuit revenue, while Duran would receive 1.5 million. By contrast, Muhammad Ali and Fraser earned 2.5 million apiece for the fight of the century in 1971. So Ray really is moving the sport forward. The psychological warfare started in the first press conference with Duran managing to get under Sugar Ray's skin. And he says, "For years, I didn't understand Duran, and the confusion was a factor in the animosity I felt towards him. I figured out Benitez. I figured out Hearns and Hagler. Understanding the essence of an opponent I was facing made it easier for me to beat the living daylights out of him, and when the fight was over, showed genuine empathy. With Duran, however, it wasn't until the last several years that I figured him out. He wasn't a madman. He only pretended to be one. He was like me, searching for a way, any way, to stand out from the rest. Boxing is a form of entertainment, and, like Hollywood, to generate the most headlines, the most dollars, one must develop a strong persona. Mine was Sugar Ray, the innocent charmer. His was Hands of Stone, the macho brute. Duran and I took on these roles without hesitation, and rarely stepped out of character, at least not until our fighting days were long gone." Greg, performers at the highest level always seem to need to control the narrative. For example, Lance Armstrong is probably the strongest example of someone determined to control his own narrative.
Yeah, controlling your own narrative, it almost becomes as important as the performance itself. Sugar Ray Leonard and Roberto Duran both understand that, and they know that boxing, as he's mentioned before, wasn't just about the skill in the ring. It's about identity, it's about storytelling, capturing the imagination of the audience, and like he said, it's entertainment, and that's ultimately what it is. They are entertainers. So the personas that they have weren't just who they were. They are very, very carefully crafted roles that elevate their presence and their ability to sell fights and basically put bums on seats, as it were. And this extends beyond boxing. Like you said, Lance Armstrong, he didn't just want to be known as a champion cyclist. He built that narrative of resilience, of overcoming impossible odds. That story amplified his fame, his influence, and even his ability to control the public perception of him for years and years, despite the controversies that eventually unraveled it. It's a reminder that at the highest levels, crafting and controlling your identity is part and parcel of the game. It's about ensuring people don't just remember what you did, but also how you made them feel and what you stood for while you did it.
Yeah, I love that. Really great breakdown of that identity piece and those personas that they carried with them throughout their careers. So, jumping ahead to the fight, Sugar Ray's preparation was actually incredibly poor, and he had every possible hanger on trying to be part of his crew, and he basically said yes to everybody, which created this really large team filled with a lot of self interest, which eventually permeated down to Sugar. And he says, I ran through my last minute preparations in the dressing room, staring as usual into the mirror, searching for signs of the performance to come. What I saw was troubling. My eyes looked vacant, disinterested. I tried to ignore it. I had no choice. At around 10:45 p.m., while the boys escorted me to the ring, it was clear that my eyes had told the truth. All I could think about was how I wished I was anywhere else in the world other than the Olympic Stadium. I felt like grabbing the microphone and saying to the 46,000 plus spectators, listen, would you all terribly mind if we went home and tried this thing tomorrow or maybe next week? Same time, same place? At that very moment, everything felt wrong, and I knew I couldn't do a damn thing about it. I believe in biorhythms, and mine felt extremely low that night. Some days you get out on the wrong side of bed and don't feel sharp. The difference between other jobs and what I do for a living is that if a fighter is off his game, even by a slight margin, he will lose and probably get hurt.
And this, for me, highlights the human side of even the most elite performers. They have those moments of doubt, though, the hesitation that comes with it, and just plain not feeling ready. Not about a lack of skill at all. It's about his mental state in that moment. And the stakes in boxing, as we know, are so high that even that slight dip of focus, slight dip in confidence, that can be absolutely catastrophic, not just for the outcome of the fight, but for that person's safety. And it's a reminder that no matter how well prepared someone is for the X amount of weeks coming into something, internal and external factors can sometimes derail even the best laid plans.
So jump into the fight, and he says, I gazed at Duran in his corner. He was glaring at me as if he was ready to bite my head off. Joe Frazier said it best when he was asked who Duran reminded him of. Charles Manson, he said. Overwhelmed at the atmosphere, I stared at the large screen above the ring. I peered into the crowd, searching for comforting faces. I was bothered by the cold, damp air. My attention was everywhere, except where it needed to be. Week after week, I thought about hurting Duran. Now with the devil himself finally in my sights, I was lost. Greg, we're talking about focus or being distracted here, aren't we?
Yeah, I think so. It's all about focus, or in this case, what we'd consider a lack of it, that distraction. His attention scattered. It's all over the place. It's clearly being pulled in every direction, apart from the one that it needs to be pulled into, which is on Roberto Duran. Cold air, the screen, the crowd. It's almost as if all of the external factors, everything outside of the ring, takes up that mental space, that mental real estate, as it were, that should be reserved and kept free for the fight itself. And it's a great reminder of how critical focus is, in particularly in high pressure moments. That's often where we see distraction come the most, in those high pressure moments. We know that even the best can get distracted when the stakes are sky high. And obviously in a sport like boxing, that loss of mental sharpness or focus, that can be the difference between victory and defeat. We also know that focus, that attention is something that's in our control, something that we can practice and get better at. So, to anyone that's listening, if you find yourself in pressure moments being distracted by things that aren't relevant to your performance, the things that are particularly important in that moment, hopefully you're not fighting Roberto Duran. Maybe it's a presentation to shareholders or to your boss. Focusing and narrowing in on those things that are most important in that moment is going to set you up for success. And everything else that is a distraction largely is irrelevant.
So I'm going to hear a little bit more about this fight because it literally is one of the most famous fights in history. And he says, soon came the first hard punch, and I realized that Hands of Stone was no exaggeration. Each well-timed shot felt like a jackhammer being drilled into my skull. My teeth knocked back so hard I had to push them into place with my glove between rounds. As dangerous as Duran was, however, his best wasn't going to put me away. I too was ready to die in the ring, and that, unfortunately, was where I went wrong. I fought Duran toe to toe instead of exploiting my superior boxing skills. Why was I so stupid? It was because I wanted to hurt Duran the way he hurt me and my wife with the constant insults. Gaining revenge became almost as important as gaining victory, and I refused to change my tactics no matter what Angelo might have told me in the corner. I was too caught up in my own anger and pride to listen to a man who had saved Ali more than once and could have saved me. I never gave him a chance. So Greg, he loses by unanimous decision, and it just seems like his emotions have just overwhelmed him here.
I think you're absolutely right there, Duncan. The fight shows how emotions can overwhelm even the best of the best. Sugar Ray, what he's done here is he's really let his anger and his pride dictate his approach and maybe cloud his judgment. He's abandoned the strategy that really plays to his strengths. So instead of boxing smart and essentially outboxing him, he's gone to fight a fighter. He's fought emotionally and he's gone toe-to-toe with Roberto Duran. And that is just setting himself up for failure because that's feeding right into Duran's style. What's striking is Leonard's self-awareness, obviously in hindsight. He knows that he's let his desire for revenge cloud his judgment and that his refusal to quit and that he wants to stand toe-to-toe, that's ultimately what's cost him the fight. So that powerful reminder that emotional control is again as important as physical skill, is again as important as being able to control your focus, particularly in high pressure situations. If you become emotionally hijacked, that's just going to put you in a bad place to perform at your best.
And I think it really speaks to the notion of athletes having a clear identity and clear plan of how they want to execute and not getting derailed by what their opponent's doing and not getting derailed by their emotions. And he says, as it turned out, I was not invincible. Equally disappointing was finding out that contrary to the image I constantly tried to convey to the press and the public, I was not a model of composure who saved his best for the sport's grandest stages. The evidence was everywhere, from my juvenile responses to Duran's antics to my inability to manage my training camp to my flawed strategy in the ring. The Duran fight was bigger than the Benitez fight, much bigger, and I hadn't been ready for it. I also needed to accept the simple fact that Roberto Duran, at least on that night, was the better man. Greg, he says, I wasn't ready for it.
We've said before that self-reflection is important, Duncan, but it's what self-reflection leads to is what truly matters. It's that action, it's that evolution, it's that growth. Reflection on its own is just the first step. We've mentioned this numerous times on this podcast. It's the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about yourself, but it's about then using those insights to make meaningful changes. That's what defines your progress. It's not just enough to acknowledge they exist. You've got to do something about it.
And here we'll hear a little bit about those lessons as he quickly demands a rematch, which is scheduled for 5 months later in New Orleans. And he says, as I worked out and dissected footage of the first fight, my conclusions came swiftly and decisively. For starters, I could not afford to be overwhelmed again by the spectacle. By the time my attention was where it should have been in Montreal on Duran, it was too late. A more disciplined mental approach and a leaner team wasn't sufficient. The most pivotal changes needed to take place inside the ropes. In Montreal, I proved to the critics that I would not back off for an instant. There was no reason to prove it again. I would fight my fight, not Duran's.
Exactly. So this is where he's translating reflection into action. I love this. You've said it again, time and time again. Great performers are great problem solvers.
So jumping ahead 5 months, it's fight night, and he says, I woke up feeling the exact opposite to how I felt on that dreary day in Montreal. My biorhythms were in perfect order, and I could not wait for showtime. Almost immediately, Duran knew, Howard Cosell knew, and the thousands of fans in the Superdome and the millions tuning in on closed circuit knew. I was not the same man I was in Montreal. Duran could take punishment, perhaps more than anyone in my era, or any era. What he could not take was being made to look like a fool. That went against the manly Latin American image he spent a lifetime building. So, Greg, for context, Sugar Ray taunted him throughout the fight and did little things to get under his skin. He kind of feigned punches and did the kind of big wound up fake punch move, which we've seen in various cartoons. And eventually, with 16 seconds to go in the eighth round, Duran threw up his arms and walked towards his corner slowly, saying "no mas," which means no more, which is one of the most famous instances in boxing. And I'll read a passage here. And he says, I took on a supporting role in a more complicated drama, in which an icon to an entire continent became, in one sudden unfortunate act, an object of derision for the rest of its life. Forgotten were the victories, the devastating knockdowns, and the hands of stone. It wasn't losing the fight. Great fighters lose fights all the time. It was how Duran lost. He quit. And that is the only thing you simply cannot do as a fighter. You can be lazy, you can be overweight, you can be dirty, you can fight past your prime, but you cannot give up. You can never give up. Of all the people in the fight game, Roberto Duran was the last one you could imagine walking away. He fought with more courage than 10 men combined, and pain never seemed to bother him. If anything, pain made him fight harder. Yet there he was, not bloodied, not battered, surrendering his title and dignity in front of the world. And while there is some question as to whether Duran actually uttered the famous words "no mas," the point was the same. He quit. What was he thinking? Did he grasp the significance of what he had just done? Did he realize he would never be seen the same way again? To this day, I still agonize over each one of my 3 defeats, and I never surrendered like Duran. I can't imagine how much "no mas" must continue to haunt him. Greg, this is an incredibly famous moment for boxing fans, and a certain level of mythology surrounds what actually happens. But ultimately, Duran put up his arms, walked to his corner, and quit.
He absolutely did. This moment, it's become one of the most infamous in boxing, and it's steeped in both that controversy and that mythology, as you talked about. The fact remains, though, that he quit. For a fighter of his stature, known for his grit and his resilience, that single act pretty much overshadowed an entire career of incredible victory and absolutely legendary toughness. You know, hands of stone, but also chin of stone as well. So what's striking here is how Leonard, even in that victory, reflects on the weight of that moment for Roberto Duran. He's recognising the enormity of what it meant for him, both in terms of legacy, there's that word again, and his identity. Fighters, they pride themselves on never giving up, no matter the circumstances. And for someone like Duran, who really does embody that toughness, this was just simply unthinkable.
And I did go back and watch it, and I'm gonna put a link in the show notes because it's quite incredible. Because it's in the 8th round. He's not out on his stool. And anyway, Greg, as a follow up, what about this notion of quitting, and how do you think that idea is viewed in society?
I think in the world of boxing, and perhaps arguably in life, quitting, it's seen as a judgment on someone's character. You've said it before that the judge within rules supreme, so you're your own police, as it were. What makes Duran's case so impactful is the contradiction. A fighter known for his unbreakable toughness and refusal to yield ends up walking away in just a way that stuns the world. It wasn't about losing. As Sugar Ray says, great fighters lose all the time, and he lost 3 times himself. It's about the way that he lost, that act of giving up, and that signal that it sends to everyone watching. In a way, I think his career has been defined by this one no mas moment. The deeper takeaway here, I think, might be about how we define perseverance and what it means to keep fighting. And even when the odds or the situation that sometimes feels insurmountable, Duran's story for me shows that even legends, even people with these personas, they're human. It reminds us that resilience, especially in that face of adversity, it's a defining trait of greatness. Now, with all of that said, it's important to recognize that sometimes quitting is absolutely the right thing to do. And when, persevering can absolutely become the wrong decision. We talked about the need to have the referee in the ring, right? That third man making sure it doesn't cross that line. There are moments when continuing to push forward, whether that's a fight, whether that's a career, whether that's any challenging situation, to be perfectly honest, might lead to some sort of irreparable harm, or might compromise or go against one of your values. The key is understanding the context and the reasons behind the choice, whatever that choice may be.
And Sugar Ray continues. He says, away from home, Sugar Ray took over as always. Wherever I went, whether in public appearances or intimate gatherings, Sugar Ray was the main event. He never shared top billing with anybody. He would not stand for it. In looking back, I could do what I did for many years, and that is to blame my boys for putting me on a pedestal. The truth is that I was the one to blame. I wanted to hear how special I was all the time, and that's why I surrounded myself with people I knew would tell me just that. Between fights with no spectators to cheer me on and no reporters to write flattering columns, the boys were where I went for applause, for validation. They never let me down. So, Greg, we're hearing this kind of split personality between Ray and Sugar Ray, that boxer versus the personality, similar to what we heard with Mike and Iron Mike Tyson.
Yeah, that's a great catch. I think the split between Ray and Sugar Ray here highlights a bit of a duality that we see a lot of high profile performers wrestle with. There's that larger than life persona that he's got that dominates basically every public space that he enters. But it's also clear that that persona that he has comes at a cost. And that cost is the constant need for validation and applause. And that drives him to surround himself with basically yes men, people that are just going to reinforce that image, even if it's not a healthy one to be reinforced. And I think it does mirror perfectly what we discussed with figures like Mike Tyson with a public persona, Iron Mike. That is both a source of strength and an incredibly heavy burden to bear.
So he has two more fights, and then it's Tommy the Hitman Hearns. And he says, I respected Tommy Hearns, but I did not fear him. I did not fear anyone. To be ready for the battle is simply not a matter of running 5 miles a day, hitting bags, jumping rope and sparring. It's about transporting one's mind to a place in which no thoughts except those related to winning the fight must be allowed to enter. I respected and liked Tommy. That didn't mean I would take it easy on him if the opportunity presented itself. I didn't take it easy on anyone. The beast in me, never far below the surface, would emerge at the appropriate times. It meant I wasn't consumed with anger, as many fighters feel they need to be, no matter whom they face. So, Greg, what stands out for you here?
I think what stands out first and foremost is the fact that he's learned from his mistakes with Duran, recognizing how he certainly in that first fight let his emotions like anger to kind of steer and direct the strategy, and how that was disastrous for him. Against Hearns, Sugar Ray's motivation has come from that higher purpose, trying to cement that legacy and proving himself to some external critics rather than from a personal vendetta like he had with Duran.
So as he steps in the ring, he says, I bounced up and down as ref Dave Pearl issued instructions. It was no secret that he was taller, and I hoped to put a little doubt in his mind. Despite our God-given talents, we were also human, and that meant being prone to insecurities like anybody else, especially as we prepared to enter a place in which there would be no escape from the opponent and ourselves. Greg, I love these mind games.
Yeah, these tactics for me, they're fascinating and a real critical part of high-level competition. This awareness of how even subtle psychological tactics. So what he's doing here is he's trying to bounce up and down to kind of blur how much taller Tommy Hearns is than himself. How that just plants a seed in Tommy Hearns' mind. That's a skill. That's not just a technical skill, not just a jab, not just a hook, not just an uppercut.
And he says, Tommy deserved the round. He landed more punches, yet sometimes you don't need to capture a round to advance your cause. This was one of those times. When a fighter is angry, and Tommy was no exception, he doesn't think clearly, as I learned the hard way in Montreal. The more I could take him out of his rhythm, the more he might leave himself open to my attacks. So he managed to get Tommy a little bit angry, but the Hitman had really the best of the fight, and Sugar was behind on the scorecards, and he says, midway through the 13th round, I got my chance, unleashing a right that hit him squarely in the head. His head snapped back as it had in the 6th. Tommy staggering along the ropes. He was hurt worse than before. I proceeded to throw about 25 punches in a row, hitting Tommy everywhere and hard. I couldn't have stopped even if I wanted to. The exhilaration as each shot met its target, the most wonderful feeling in the world. I fed off the roar of the crowd and the sight of my opponent in trouble, ready to be destroyed. And to think there were people who had questioned if I could be ferocious enough when it was necessary. How wrong they were. I loved to hit other men. I loved to see them crumble. Tommy fell into the ropes and was practically on the canvas, even though referee Dave Purley didn't rule it a knockdown, and then told Tommy to get up instead of asking him if he could get up.
Thanks, ref.
Yeah, perfect, ref. And he says, I nearly ran from my corner for the start of round 14. Tommy escaped in round 6 and 7 from a certain knockout, and in part due to my negligence. He wasn't going to escape this time. A right to the head, a hook to the body, 4 more to the right, The great Tommy Hearns was a punching bag. Again, I couldn't stop. Thankfully, with a minute and 15 seconds to go in the round, Davy Purley stopped it for me. I wasn't much better off than Tommy was. When Janks and my brothers lifted me into the air, I slumped into their arms and almost collapsed onto the canvas. I had nothing left. Everything went into those last 2 rounds. Everything and more. 30 years later, the fight remains my defining moment as a fighter. I was at the peak of my abilities, and so was Tommy. So again, to reflect, Sugar Ray wins by TKO in the 14th, and really that notion of be at your best when your best is needed.
It was an unbelievable fight. Do you think we can put the link in the show notes?
Yeah, absolutely, I will. And of course, Greg, with now more fame, more distractions, and it's a tale as old as time, unfortunately. There's more women, more alcohol, and now cocaine. And he says, on the third or fourth bottles, I forgot why I started to drink in the first place. Little did I realize that these desperate escapes into alcohol and later cocaine would soon become almost a daily occurrence. And they weren't really escapes at all. I was not free, furthest thing from it. There was nothing like pounding the bag or some poor soul's face to flush the anger out of my system. Without the gym, I needed a new haven, and it didn't take me long to find one. If I could handle Benitez, Duran and Hearns, I could certainly handle a little white powder. Coke made me feel like I did in the ring, in complete control. I became funny, engaging, articulate. Coke made the anxieties go away. I was Sugar Ray again. One friend I used as a supplier estimates that I spent $250,000 per year on coke, and I bet he's not far off.
Well, Duncan, I've heard it said that every saint has a past and every sinner has a future. That line between escape and dependency, it's so thin. Sugar Ray Leonard's story shows how that fame, that pressure, and that loss of routine can lead even the strongest individuals to search for that substitute, for structure and the catharsis that often comes from somewhere else, that public adulation and, let's face it, the buzz that you get performing in the ring. So his reliance on the gym to channel his anger and his anxieties had been that healthy outlet, but without it, he's found himself drawn to something far more destructive.
And during this time after the Tommy Hearns fight, he finds out that he has a partial detachment of the retina, making it very difficult to see out of one eye, and he considers retirement. And in the book, he kind of goes in and out of retirement. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to follow when he's out of retirement, when he's fighting. He ends up fighting in 1982 against Bruce Finch and then against Kevin Howard. After the Howard fight in 1984, he says he's done. He says he's struggling with drugs, alcohol, and eye injury, and this is a reflection on this stage of a career. And he's really kind of on that downward spiral. And he says, I was in a much different fight and losing badly. The plunges into alcohol and coke more frequent and dangerous than before. With my departure from the sport official, gone was any possibility of an imminent return to the world I relied on to avoid pain. Without any warning, I'd be reminded of the 2 men who sexually abused me, or the memory of my parents cursing at one another, screaming, wailing, and out of control would suddenly overwhelm me. I proved to be as weak as ever. Surrendering once more to the temptations of fame, I went back to drugs. I went back to loose women. I went back to being Sugar Ray. The next 2 years remain a blur, one sad, shameful incident leading to another. I was on the run again. I did not miss fighting. I missed preparing to fight. I missed the zone that enabled me, if temporarily, to escape the pain.
Wow, Duncan, this reflection shows how deeply intertwined Sugar Ray Leonard's identity was with boxing. When the sport's no longer there to give that structure and that purpose, it's clear that he found himself spiraling that addiction and those self-destructive behaviours. It's, to be honest, it's a bit heartbreaking to see how the absence of that preparation and that routine, the discipline, the focus, all of those things that we mentioned earlier on, or the positives that sport give and those things that come along with fighting, those are the things that leave him vulnerable to the pain and the memories that he's used that sport to try very hard to bury. What's striking for me is the acknowledgement that it wasn't the fights that he missed, but it was the preparation and that sense of control that he's talked about, the catharsis and the escape from that inner turmoil that he had experienced previously. Without that, he's left to essentially face that unresolved trauma and the pressure that he's been able to avoid his entire life. And there's a saying that goes, a man's like a racehorse, you've got to run him, otherwise he'll tear down the barn. So it really raises an important point, Duncan, here about how athletes and high performers in general often struggle when their source of purpose is taken away from them.
Yeah, that's an excellent reflection. But there's one more fighter out there of the great four during the era that he has not fought, and he says, Lacking the motivation wasn't a problem against Hagler. From the moment I decided in the spring of 1986 to take him on, I was sure of one thing. I wanted to tear the man apart. The odds were heavily against me, and why wouldn't they be? Boxing was filled with proud warriors who came out of retirement only to discover that they should have stayed away forever, their skills never the same after a long layoff. When I first retired as a pro in 1982, I prided myself on being the rare exception in my sport, the fighter wise enough to get out before it became too late. If I was whipped by Hagler, a real possibility, he hadn't lost in 11 years, I would join the long list of disgraced ex-champions, leaving one lasting, pathetic image for the public I worked endlessly to impress. Over the previous 5 years, I spent less than 27 minutes in the ring, while Hagler took on 8 opponents, 57 rounds during the same period. So, Greg, retirement's never guaranteed as a comeback is just around the corner. What do you make of this one?
Yeah, boxing's littered with people that have gone away and come back. This comeback for him, though, it's about defying expectations and trying to reclaim that identity, and maybe even proving to himself and the world that he still belongs at the top. And as he mentions, the odds, the layoff, and the doubts from the critics only add to the stake. What's striking here is his awareness of the risk. Obviously, he knows that a loss could tarnish his legacy and undo that very carefully crafted image that he worked really so hard to build, certainly within the ring. Yet instead of being paralyzed by that fear, he's again used it as fuel and been motivated by the challenge and the opportunity to really sort of cement his place in boxing history.
So this is 1986-87 money. Hagler, the champion, was guaranteed 11.75 million, while Sugar Ray earned 11 million, which is a lot of money.
A lot of money. That is a lot of money.
Yeah. And I love this. A key negotiation strategy by Mike Trainer, who works for Sugar Ray, was that they fought to reduce the fight to 12 rounds instead of the standard 15. And it was really a tactic in negotiation they used to pressure Hagler. Although Ray was always prepared to fight 15 rounds if necessary, he wanted the Hagler team to believe that he couldn't go 15 rounds, but in reality, he trained for 15 rounds. Again, I love those kind of mind games. And eventually they did settle on 12 rounds, so it really worked out for him. And he says, from that day forward, everything I said to the reporters over the following 5 months was designed to work on Hagler's psyche. I felt that was his weakest part. I was measuring him the same way I measured fighters in the ring, looking for an opening and pouncing on it. So there's actually a part in the book where he sends spies to Hagler's open workouts, and he says about one of these spies, he says he noticed that just before the bell would sound to begin every round, Hagler would go and stand in the middle of the ring as if he declared, "This is my territory, pal. I dare you to try and take it away from me." I decided if I accomplished nothing else at Caesar's Palace, I would reach the center of the ring before he did. Greg, I think these little psychological battles are just fascinating. And Duran had told Sugar Ray how to beat Hagler, and he says, I would do instead what Duran told me in 1983. You box him, you beat him. When the bell rang for round 1, I accomplished my first goal. I beat Hagler to the center of the ring. I felt like putting up a flag. My goal was to win a round. I needed to steal as many early rounds as possible, in case the long layoff took its toll. As the bell rang, when I was about to throw a left, Hagler flinched and covered up. I suddenly realized the fearless Hagler was as nervous as I was. He was mine. In the 7th, my legs began to go. They had carried me this far, longer perhaps than I had any right to expect. I would now have to rely on my will and intelligence to contend with the fresher Hagler, who pinned me against the ropes again and connected with a series of good shots.
Duncan, this really captures the razor-thin margins of greatness here. Sugar Ray Leonard's strategy, it's brilliant. He knew the layoff might catch up to him, so his focus on stealing those early rounds was as much about preparation as it was about psychology. When he saw Hagler flinch, when he was about to throw that left hand, he realised that even the seemingly invincible had doubts, and that single moment of hesitation shifted that mental dynamic of the fight.
1 round to go. I sat on my stool awaiting Angelo's final words of encouragement. He didn't let me down. We got 3 minutes, he said. New champion, new champion. I jumped up and raised both gloves in the air. The fans roared. Many had not been on my side to start, but the fact that I was still standing in the ring with the invincible Hagler won them over. All I had to do was stand until the end, and I'd be the winner, with the public and myself, whether the judges saw it that way or not. I walked towards the center of the ring. I had claimed that spot since the opening round, and I was not about to surrender it now. As the bell rang, I could not resist getting inside Hagler's head one last time. "Want to fight me now?" I said. "Want to fight me?" These were the only words I said to him the entire fight. So Sugar Ray wins by split decision, and there's a little more here, and he says, "In retrospect, near a quarter of a century later, the victory in 1987 means as much to me now as it did then, maybe more. If the fight with Tommy was my greatest achievement in the ring, the fight with Hagler was my proudest. I was not at my best. I was nowhere near my best ever again after I beat Tommy. I don't care who you are. You can't take 3 years off in this sport, which asks for everything you have, and expect to come back and be the same. Ali couldn't. I couldn't. Yet, the will deep inside me did come back for one night, and that was enough." So jumping ahead, in the spring of 1989, Sugar Ray Leonard returns to the ring for a rematch against Tommy Hearns, 8 years after their first iconic fight. They were both in their 30s now, and they were no longer the fighters they'd been in 1981, but they remained among the world's best. It was dubbed The War. It was a highly anticipated bout at Caesar's Palace, and it promised record earnings, 13 million for Leonard and 11 million for Hearns. So Sugar Ray is certain that he had lost the fight, and by all accounts, Tommy won the fight, and he says, "The only certainty left was the margin of defeat. I braced myself for the announcement. The judges must have been watching a different fight. It was ruled a draw. What saved me was my aggressiveness in the final round. I was stunned." Unlike Hagler, Tommy had the right to feel robbed. He didn't. That's because he accomplished something more important than winning the fight. He redeemed himself. For the rest of his life, he would be able to say that on June 12, 1989, he held his own against me, and that was enough. So Sugar Ray continues to fight on, and he fights Roberto Duran again in 1989. Roberto Duran had really resurrected his career, but Sugar Ray wins again by unanimous decision. But at this stage, Greg, the era of the four great fighters, Roberto Hands of Stone Duran, Marvelous Marvin Hagler, Tommy the Hitman Hearns, and Sugar Ray Leonard, was over. Sugar Ray would eventually lose his final two fights of his career, but by that time his best years were way behind him, and as they say, lions don't die of old age, they die in the jaws of younger lions.
I'm assuming that they're all in the Boxing Hall of Fame, and if they're not because of their records and their abilities, they should be because of their nicknames.
Yeah, they are. I looked it up.
They're magnificent. Those are magnificent, magnificent nicknames.
So to wrap up, he says, "Being sober for the last 4 years has helped me see a great deal. I see the pain I caused to those I cared about most and who cared about me the most. I blame the alcohol or the cocaine or the character I created, Sugar Ray, as if I had nothing to do with him. I never blamed myself, till now. Don't get me wrong, I have nothing against Sugar Ray. I know how fortunate I was to have him around. Because of him, I saw the world and was introduced to people I would never have met. I escaped the unfortunate fate that befell many of my friends. When I was 15, I was asked by a local reporter who I wanted to be when I grew up. I did not hesitate. I want to be special, I said. But when I think of Sugar Ray, I am most grateful for a reason that has nothing to do with money or fame. He was there when I needed a place for my pain and anger. Without him, I can't imagine how my life might have turned out. Because of Sugar Ray, I learned how to accept Ray. When I look in the mirror, my eyes are warm, caring, at peace." And Greg, that is where we'll leave it. But as always, what is your top 10 life lessons from The Big Fight by Sugar Ray Leonard?
Top 10 life lessons from The Big Fight, My Life in and Out of the Ring by Sugar Ray Leonard. Number 1, face your inner demons. Success requires confronting personal struggles rather than burying them. He says, "I blame the alcohol or the cocaine or the character I created, Sugar Ray, as if I had nothing to do with him. I never blame myself, till now." Number 2, find strength in vulnerability. Accepting pain and fear can uncover untapped inner strength. He says, "I learned how to summon from somewhere deep within the extra will I didn't know I possessed." Number 3, preparation fuels confidence. Meticulous preparation creates the foundation for greatness. He says, "When I reflect on what I miss most about my boxing career, it's the hours and hours of searching for the ways to exploit my opponent's weaknesses." Number 4, control your emotions. Emotional discipline is key to peak performance. He says, "Gaining revenge became almost as important as gaining victory, and I refuse to change my tactics no matter what," talking about his fight with Roberto Duran. Number 5, embrace both roles in life. Balancing who you are in the spotlight and who you are privately is essential for personal growth. He says, because of Sugar Ray, I learned how to accept Ray. Number 6, learn from defeat. Losses, whether in the ring or in life, often offer critical lessons for improvement. He says, I also needed to accept the simple fact that Roberto Duran, at least on that night, was the better man. Number 7, surround yourself with the right team. Success depends on the loyalty and expertise of those around you. He says, Mike Trainer was fiercely loyal and a savvy businessman, ensuring that no one, including himself, could exploit me financially. Number 8, adapt and evolve. Growth requires flexibility and willingness to change tactics. He said, I would fight my fight, not Duran's. And of course, that was going into the rematch. Number 9, pursue excellence relentlessly. True greatness comes from the consistent effort and commitment to improvement. He says, that goal was what inspired me to go running at 5 o'clock each morning and to hit the bags until my hands could take no more. And finally, number 10, seek meaning beyond fame. Fulfillment comes not from accolades, but from personal peace and purpose. He says, when I look in the mirror, my eyes are warm, caring, at peace.
As always, a fantastic top 10, Greg, but what are the 10 top life lessons to avoid from The Big Fight by Sugar Ray Leonard?
Here are my top 10 behaviors to avoid from The Big Fight, My Life in and Out of the Ring by Sugar Ray Leonard. Number 1, burying pain instead of addressing it. Avoid ignoring emotional wounds and using fame as a distraction. He says, I buried it, which made me feel even worse. Number 2, letting anger control decisions. Avoid allowing emotions to dictate strategies or actions. He says, I fought Duran toe-to-toe instead of exploiting my superior boxing skills. Why was I so stupid? Number 3, overindulging in fame and wealth. Avoid using success as an excuse for reckless behavior. And he said, cars, women, they were all toys. Number 4, surrendering to addiction. Avoid using substances as a way to escape pain or pressure. He said, Coke made the anxieties go away. It made me Sugar Ray again. Number 5, neglecting family responsibilities. Avoid prioritizing fame over personal relationships. I wasn't the first and I won't be the last celebrity to surrender to the irresistible temptations fame provides. Number 6, failing to set boundaries. Avoid letting others take advantage of your generosity. He says, to my family and friends, I was no longer Ray the son, Ray the brother, or Ray the buddy. I was Ray the bank. Number 7, ignoring team dynamics. Avoid allowing mismanagement within your team to disrupt your focus. He said, I said no to nobody, which created a large team filled with self-interest. Number 8, underestimating opponents. Avoid dismissing the skill or psychology of competitors. Duran wasn't a madman, he only pretended to be one. Number 9, failing to recognize your limits. Avoid pushing too far physically or mentally without acknowledging the risks. He says, that's what separates the good fighters from those who make history. On the other hand, it's also when a fighter may give too much. And finally, number 10, sacrificing health for success. Avoid ignoring injuries or signs of physical strain to continue competing. He says, I thought about the risks I would be taking to my health and to my legacy. Would I have to depend on another person for the most menial of tasks? Thank you so much for joining myself and Duncan on this episode. And as always, please support the show by rating us 5 stars on your podcast platform. And why not leave us a review? That'll help us grow the show. And for that, we are truly grateful. We will see you next time on Performers.